break. Let's jump in a panel, if that's okay, with Tammy and Robin joining us as well, in conversations about performance and things to know and things to keep in mind. Well, welcome everyone. Wonderful to have you all here, and thank you so much for your wonderful presentations today. Well, I'm sure, but by the way, dear friends, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat and I'm going to bring them up. I did write down a few, but I might have missed some of them. So let's see how that goes. Now, I want to ask, actually, just, it's kind of always an interesting story for us. We've been in this industry for many of us for a very long time. And when I look at technology, it seems like it's never been better. We have 5G coming up. We have incredible tooling. The browsers have never been better. We have HTTP3 now as well. And is the web getting better as a result? When we look into performance issues, we have this performance gap that Alex Russell is speaking about, right? As you go look into mobile space, you have low-end devices where the experience is just extremely frustrating, and obviously you have high-end devices where the experience is fantastic. But most people would not enjoy the wonderful experiences you get on this high-end device. So maybe I could start with Tammy first. In terms of performance culture, we've been kind of preaching and talking about performance budgets and all those things for a long time now. So what do we need to do to actually close that performance gap, and kind of really improve performance on a big scale? It's a difficult question to answer, I guess.
Yeah, I've got a total elevator answer to that. So to the first point that you raised, is the web is it getting better? I was actually having a chat with my 16-year-old about this last night because, we've recently upgraded our internet and we have this 1 gigabit connection. According to my telecom, it's really more like 350 if I actually test it. But what I told him was that it's really more like the spectrum of experiences has gotten so much broader. So it used to be that we were in this little spectrum where you could more or less count on the fact that other people were kind of like you, but maybe plus or minus a bit on either side. And now it's just this massive gamut of experiences that are affected by the fact that people are using devices that are really old, underpowered, or they're on really terrible connections, or kind of communities that are experiencing poor connectivity. I would say it's just kind of getting control of our pages. I look at waterfalls all the time, and I'm sure Addy and Robin would agree, where it's just kind of a horror show where you see pages that are, as I mentioned in my talk, 10, 15 megabytes in size, massive waterfalls, unoptimized images, third parties kind of, out the yin yang, and it's kind of bonkers. And I think people just have lost a lot of visibility into that, and they don't kind of know where to start. It's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, so
that wasn't an answer. That was more just
no, that's fine. That's fine. It's just my personal thought is I can see companies introducing performance budgets, sometimes struggling to define a good performance budget and kind of really understanding, okay, this is going to work and this is where we need to go. But then you try to cut, and it's really hard to say, okay, so what is a good performance budget, for example? And it seems like the performance budget has become one of those tools that we're using to kind of stay on track, I would say, in our performance efforts. But very often, as we, just as you said, very often it's just totally out of our control and things just explode. And that kind of really brings me to maybe another question that's probably more for Robin. I always have the same argument that I have to deal with at the time when I'm working on projects or anything. And that's, well, will technology ever just save us? Again, 5G, HTTP3, will they at some point just overcome all these front-end performance issues? Because, we have this incredible technology, and we have maybe in 5 years from now incredible devices in our pockets. So we will not have to worry about images anymore or things like that? Or is it not going to happen? What do you think? Robin,
no, I think I think everything we're seeing now is incredibly incremental. And it's offering some benefits, but definitely not the big things anymore. The big benefits is what you get indeed by doing the best practices that we know. And once you've done all of that, then something like HTTP3 or 5G won't do all that much anymore. I totally agree with what Tammy said, is that we need to first make sure that people know how to build better pages, and then you can start looking at how to improve that a little bit by these new technologies. But I think we've seen like CPUs and networks become so much faster over the years. Like if you compare networks that we have now to even 10 years ago, it's amazing, and yet we're still having web performance meetings like these even more frequently now than maybe then. So it's like what they often say is that the more you give, the more the performance you give to developers, the laxer they become in how they optimize for these things. And I think one of the things we need is, again, a very constrained platform, um, which to me always enforces people to go back to the things that we learned 10 years ago about how to really optimize for stuff. I hoped this would be something like the VR goggles that we had, right? I hoped that would be like, okay, these things don't have a very good CPU. We still want to do some impressive stuff on them. You're really going to need to optimize these experiences to be able to do that. Sadly, hasn't really really happened yet. But I think that
Yeah.
that kind of stuff might help us. But no, hoping for 5G and H3 to help to save us from what we're currently doing, that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. Well, maybe then a question to Addy. Do you think that all the wonderful insights you brought up in the talk today, and maybe in your book as well about images, will they be still relevant, more relevant, let's say 5 years from now?
That's a good question. I think to the topic that you were just discussing, latency really abhors a vacuum, and so even if the platform and the spec level and a protocol level things get much better, developers are probably going to continue to try building more complex experiences and place even more high demand on CPUs, chipsets, networks, and so on. I think that the types of problems are probably going to remain quite similar, but what people want out of these platforms is a lot of flexibility, and they want us to somehow figure out how we can get complexity out of their way. The way there are some different options here. There is, to Robin's point, how much can we add constraints to the platform or better budgets into the platform while still allowing people to build really compelling user experiences? Because we don't want people to just be building, very, very basic, not interesting pages. We want people to build awesome web applications. But how do we enable them to do that in a way that also gives a good user experience on low-end devices? I think that's an interesting challenge. Some of the ways we're solving that are trying to bake in better defaults in modern stacks. I would love to see if, for early adopters, we make the platforms, give them as much control as possible. And then for everybody else, especially in the torso and tail, how can we take all of those learnings and bake them into the stacks so you don't have to really worry about these problems quite as much? Right. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's progress possible.
Yeah, that there is also one note that I kind of see companies doing now, just because we have such a diversity in terms of devices that people are using and so on. So while in the past we were basically just designing screens for a fixed size, we moved to responsive with mobile, tablet, desktop, and everything in between. And now what I feel like when I see it, some teams, especially in large teams, you don't just get a bunch of components, be it React, Angular or whatever. You kind of have different sets of components, a different behavior of components depending if it's 2G, 3G, 4G, or Wi-Fi and all. And this really kind of increases complexity even more, because where do we even finish then? So you end up with literally large families of components, and that's just a start. You think about images, you think about web font loading, that's a separate book right there, I'm sure, right? So that kind of brings me to this question. So when we're looking into this complexity that we have, and that's a question before I dive into questions that we get in the chat as well, I see a lot of people being quite frustrated, not even knowing where to start, especially if they're getting in front end. So I'm getting this question quite a bit. So if I'm just new to front end now, I feel extremely scared about this. Like if you were getting in front end today, how would you feel? That's a very unusual question, but let me ask that anyway. Anybody wants to pick it up?
I think, I mean, it's sort of what I mentioned when I was doing my talk was the fact that, yeah, like I think that 2 or 3 years ago, if I were getting into front end, I would be really overwhelmed and kind of terrified because I've mentioned kind of this wild west of metrics. It does feel like I talk to a lot of companies and people, companies of all different sizes, that since Google announced Core Web Vitals, that it's given people something to focus on, and it's taken some of that terror, that feeling of overwhelm away from people. And so that's what I point people towards. So I think if I were a newcomer, in this space now, I would just kind of gravitate towards like, okay, that's our new load time or start render or whatever we were focusing on like 10 years ago.
Anybody wants to continue, or I have another question right there.
I sometimes feel like that, like I'm only getting into front end today because I kind of consciously skipped most of the React and related frameworks early stuff. And when I try to get into it now, it's very scary.
Yeah, that's a journey, right? That's
It's
a journey.
very scary, and that is just like the React stuff. How do you build the websites nowadays? But then you get all of the stuff that Addy was talking about, very complex stuff. Then you get even understanding what HTTP3 is cost me, what was it? A lot of thousands of words on the Smashing
That's
magazine
right.
just to
That's
explain
right.
like the basics, and that was like the minimum you need to know. So people are getting so overwhelmed, I think, and they
Yeah.
start with the basics. They get to know that good enough, and then they kind of probably stop because everything else costs way too much time to still be productive. And
Yeah.
I love what Addy was saying to that. We need to make sure that the platform provides much more sensible defaults and things that people
absolutely.
don't need to.
So that's a very interesting actually approach to the Aurora project, right? Where kind of try to plug in performance by default, which I think is a very, very important initiative as well. Tammy did mention Core Web Vitals, and that brings me actually to one question that also comes up quite a bit. It actually came up in Slack as well. Are Core Web Vitals fixed, or are they kind of supposed to evolve over time? And if they do evolve, do we track it? Like, how do we actually know? Is it kind of announced, or is it something that's just, do we expect more things to be added in to Web Vitals, be it accessibility or security, privacy, and so on? Maybe that would be a good question for Addy to answer.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I'll also use this as an opportunity to give shout outs to a number of folks in the Chrome scene working on this problem, Annie Sullivan and her team in particular. I think that over the last probably 5 or 6 years in particular, our ability to understand the aspects of user experience that are really important has evolved, and the metrics that we encourage developers to optimize for have been trying to also evolve in that direction to be more user-centric. And so every year, every couple of years, we're very likely to have another moment where our ability to understand, quantify, and measure an aspect of performance is going to change in some way. To give you a very concrete example, if you take a look at the current Core Web Vitals and first input delay in particular, the current first input delay metric as well as the threshold is in a place where it's relatively lenient. Most people will get a green on it right now, but at the same time, we also know that there are a lot of sites out there that are causing plenty of long tasks, shipping tons of JavaScript down to their users, and that remains an opportunity for us to be able to deliver better experiences. And so what I'm really excited about is if you just take a look at that one metric, it's trying to measure interaction readiness. I see us potentially being able to evolve that metric into something Annie's team are working on. They're working on a responsiveness metric right now that is able to give you a lot more nuance around that problem space. So will the Core Web Vitals expand? I think we're likely to see them continue to get refined as they better understand modern content over the years. In terms of other metrics that may go in there, I think TBD. There is definitely interest in exploring other dimensions outside of the current metrics, but we also want to try balancing that with, not overwhelming developers. There are plenty of folks who are already just looking at LCP and look at all the things you have to do to get a good LCP. It's like there's a lot of work. And so we're trying to keep that in mind. We don't want to overwhelm people, we also want to make sure that we're measuring the right things and that achievability is in a reasonable place. Because if 90% of people can't necessarily optimize for a metric, that's a little weird. So I think that achievability is something we can work with frameworks and CMSs and the browser to get folks into a better place on. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's lots of room to evolve and still.
Okay, that's good to hear. I think there was a talk, I think maybe 1 year ago. I don't remember where I heard it or where I was watching it, but there was a session about specifically core web vitals and how they might be changing and might be evolving. So I just wanted to bring this up here as well. Maybe that's a good time, before again I jump into questions from the audience, for Robin to answer the question that bothers us all. Why do we need HTTP 3 where we just got HTTP 2? What's the deal with HTTP 3? Robin, tell us.
Okay. Difficult topic. Long and short of it, we didn't need a new an HTTP version. HTTP 2 was kind of okay at the HTTP layer. We needed something better below. So if you know something about network protocols, it's like a stack of different protocols, and HTTP 2 runs on top of TCP, the Transport Control Protocol. And it's there that we had some problems. TCP has been around since the 80s and has had serious troubles evolving over time. So we tried making like a TCP 2.0, but we had some serious trouble actually deploying that on the actual internet because there are so many devices that think they know TCP, but it turns out they really don't know TCP, and they make all kinds of mistakes when trying to interpret that. And so what we basically did was make a new version of TCP called QUIC. So a new QUIC protocol. And QUIC is very much like TCP in many, many ways. One of the main changes is that it encrypts everything. So it's encrypted or secure by default. So it's very, very similar, but it's just different enough in some tiny areas, but just enough that we cannot run HTTP 2 over QUIC as is. So HTTP 3 is like a very small, tiny modifications to HTTP 2 just to be able to run on top of QUIC. And because HTTP 2.1 or HTTP 2 over QUIC doesn't really sound too sexy, they termed it HTTP 3. Right, but so the real innovation is one layer lower than that. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. That answers the question. Well, I think it's really time for us to move into the Q&A here in the chat. There are so many questions. And there are actually quite many of them are related to images. So, Addy, get ready. One of the first questions that came up is by Robert. And Robert is wondering if lazy loading off-screen only, incoming links to anchors or text fragments would still have LCP. Is there any way we can avoid that?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes. We lazy load off-screen only, incoming links to anchors or text fragments. So whenever you jump, let's say if you have CSS in place, right, and you'll be jumping in to comment section in an article, so you will be getting an LCP penalty, right? Can we do something with it?
So what I would expect, especially, just to play that back, my understanding is the question is all about you have off-screen images that you potentially want to lazy load. You might have, text fragments, links that go into that content lower down, and there's worry that maybe that would impact largest contentful paint. In those cases, I think that what I would be trying to do is make sure that you have some triggers in place that can understand has the person actually gone lower down the screen. For the browser, what we've actually done for lazy loading in Chrome, and I think this is the case for Firefox as well, is that the thresholds are not so aggressive that the images are going to begin loading exactly when somebody gets to that point in the page. It starts to load a little bit higher up. And so I would expect that the fetch for that image load would likely happen a little bit earlier than you think it's happening. And I would imagine the LCP impact to be a little bit lower in that case, personally. But it is a good example and something I'd love to maybe follow up on measuring. I don't expect there to be a massive impact to LCP there, personally.
All right, that's useful. Here's another one that's probably more for Tammy. Jesper is wondering, do you have any suggestions on how to incorporate Core Web Vitals in a performance budget and staying on top of it over time?
Yes, I do. So one of the great things about Core Web Vitals is that they've been out for a while now. And so most monitoring tools, if not all, allow you to track them. So with synthetic monitoring, you can track largest contentful pane and cumulative layout shift, but not first input delay. But then there are other proxy metrics you can track, like total blocking time or CPU metrics like that. And if you're using a RUM tool, then you can track all of the Core Web Vitals. So some best practices that I would recommend are if you're using RUM, make sure that you're tracking everything at the 75th percentile, because that's what Google's recommended thresholds are, and those thresholds are publicly available, really easy to find. And just for anybody who's not familiar with what a performance budget is, I can quickly explain what that is. Basically, it's a threshold that you set for specific metrics, and you can even make it really, really refined to a specific type of page, specific browser, that kind of thing. But it's a threshold that you create, and depending on the tool, you create the threshold and you get alerted anytime you go out of bounds. What I want people to be really clear on, because this gets a little bit lost in the haze, is people think that a performance budget is a goal, that it's aspirational, and it's not. Goals are great, and you should absolutely have performance goals that are kind of based on kind of industry benchmarking or what have you. But a performance budget is really, its value is in helping you fight regression. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is about how do we make sure that we're not building pages that kind of keep inflating beyond what our networks and our tech can actually deliver for us. And I kind of put out the theory that this is just, me kind of thinking out loud, that if you were to fight regression for your site, for like basically say like, you know what, I'm going to hard stop on this metric. It's not going to get, we will not allow it to get worse. In 5 years, the technology actually kind of catches up with the pages that we're building right now, and yay, faster web for all. I don't know, maybe I'm just sort of building castles in the sky, but I would say that if we could all kind of set the goal for ourselves to not just get faster, but just not get slower, that would be amazing.
Yeah, that's definitely good advice. And as you're mentioning castles in the sky, there is also one question from Nicholas that might be related to castles in the sky. And it's about service workers. The question is, weren't service workers supposed to save us all? In the end, you cache for the first time, and then boom, you have incredible performance boost right there. And essentially the question is, so where are we with service workers? For most projects, especially modern projects, I guess, new websites and new applications being built, service workers will be a default. But it seems like we didn't really get that performance boost to a scale that we were expecting. I guess this is where the question is. So how are we feeling about it, Eddie?
Why am I the person that's on the spot for service workers?
I don't know. I'm just curious.
I guess I'll share. So my perspective is that and this is nobody's fault, our understanding of the costs associated with getting a page loaded are perhaps not as nuanced as they always could be. There are a lot of things involved in loading a modern page. Like there are inter-process communication, there's IPC costs, there's storage, there's how quickly can we read off disk versus refetching things from the network. There's a whole host of other problems in that space. And service workers are not magically going to be able to address all of these issues. There is a cost to like booting up a service worker. You can use navigation preload, you can use like other techniques to try addressing some of these, but it does have a cost. And so service workers were never going to magically like boost performance. I do think that they lend themselves well to encouraging people to break up their UIs and break up their work in a way that lends itself better to caching of templates, caching of partials, and maybe being able to improve subsequent page navigation performance a little bit better than today. But it's going to vary by experience. I don't know if that's a cop-out or a reasonable answer.
That's okay. That's okay. I like bringing up complicated questions or some questions that are difficult to answer, I guess. Well, maybe the last question before we are wrapping up here. There was one question that was actually quite interesting, namely, how do you actually maintain performance over time? So we're all speaking about improving performance, but then, performance budget is kind of a way of keeping performance intact. But as technology evolves, right, at some point let's say a big corporation with a huge legacy site needs to know that it needs to transform to AVIF, and maybe eventually, I don't know, who knows, in 5 years or 3 years, to JPEG XL. And then, now we need to bring in HTTP3 into place, right? And, okay, we now need to have some proper RAM tool like speed curve maybe in place. How do you keep up with all those things actually to stay on top of performance? Is there the kind of, I don't know, the magic bullet, the golden key to success? Anybody wants to pick it up?
I just like Henri's answer in the chat. It's like monitoring.
Monitoring, that sounds about right.
Yeah, just like, I obviously love, monitoring tools. But whether or not it's Speaker or another tool, just use something and track your pages over time, and within the same tool, and just keep an eye on things. I think that the big mistake people make is taking their eye off of their metrics, taking their eye off their site, thinking that performance is just this thing they need to do sporadically. It's an ongoing effort. And I think also just realizing it's huge, and it's, it's really easy to accidentally be a gatekeeper, think it's all on your own shoulders. And really anybody who touches a page is responsible for the performance of that page, whether or not they're a developer, marketer, executive, whoever. So kind of spreading the load and the responsibility out, and getting everybody on board with what your performance budget should be and where you're at and where you want to be, and giving everybody visibility into the tools you're using. So I think if you really want to be successful over time, you have to just think about it as being this ongoing team project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Are there any actually maybe newsletters that you would recommend, maybe resources to stay on top as well?
Well, I really like this annual front-end performance checklist that
that's a beast.
Somebody named Vitaly Friedman puts together every year. So if folks are not familiar with that, it's really handy, because it's just a really good place to start. It's, I love when you bring that out every year, because you exhaustively update it and make sure it's kind of, I was gonna say up to speed. God, I hate it when I do that. But basically to kind of start there and just think these are all the steps that you need to take. So yeah, I would recommend something like that.
Yeah, my December is usually busy. That is true. That is true. Robin, Addy, what kind of newsletters, resources would you recommend for somebody who really wants to stay up to date in what's going on as we're wrapping up?
I'll say first of all, I personally love using speed curve a lot for monitoring. So I thanks, Tammy. Outside of that, I'm a really big fan of the Caliber performance newsletter that they do. It's very well refined set of recommendations every time it goes out. People in the community, Stefan Judas and so on. There's a lot of individual people who put out good performance content pretty regularly. So check those things.
Excellent. Robin, any wise words from the from the world of HTTP3 or not on HTTP3 protocols? Anything?
Sadly, I haven't yet found very good web performance newsletters that focus on networking side of things or things related to that. I also really love the Caliber newsletter. I have that, and then I also follow Front End Focus, I think it's called, which also has it has a nice mix of everything. Which is always good to do. And what I love to do most for my things is Twitter. Just go on Twitter, follow some of the key people here, and you will get daily fantastic updates on all the great web performance stuff. Yeah.
The WebPerf hashtag on Twitter, I think I've been following it for 10 years. It's amazing.
Fantastic.
Oh, and there is also a web performance Slack.
Yes.
Slack group, which is also very busy at times.
Excellent. Well, maybe, who knows, maybe this little meetup will be an inspiration for you, Robin, to set up another new newsletter about HTTP3 networking protocols and everything in between. Who knows? we never know what happens after the workshop, after the meetup. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for answering questions and taking your time from your busy schedules, I'm sure. I'm looking forward to rewatching some of the sessions as well, just to dive in deeper. And by the way, if you do want to rewatch as well, dear friends, for joining us today, we will be sending you links with recordings, and we'll be asking speakers, of course, for slides too. So we'll be sharing everything with you soon. With this in mind, please give a round of warm any kind and type of emoji you prefer in the chat to Tammy, Robin, and Addy joining us today. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. This is really fun.
Thank you, and hopefully see you soon.